This is the Plant Yourself Podcast. I'm Howard Jacobson of PlantYourself.com and the Big Change Program with Josh LaJaunie. This podcast is part of my mission to help you live a fruitful and fun life. Two quick things. First, you can still get the report, the No Recipe Required cheat sheet at plantyourself.com/cheat. Just give me a name and an email so I know where to send it, and you'll also get a complimentary subscription to the Big Change Bulldog. What is the No Recipe Required cheat sheet? It's just a list, a couple pages long, of like meals you can make for breakfast, lunches, dinners, desserts, snacks, just without needing cookbooks, recipes, just, stuff that we know how to make, and sometimes we're just in need of an idea. So you can get that at plantyourself.com/cheat. CHEAT, all lowercase. Second thing is, Josh and I are opening up the Big Change Program again to a small cohort. We're going to experiment with sort of bringing people in small groups and integrating them into the existing program, because we discovered that the two cohorts that we're running, one started in August and one started in January, are merging together quite nicely, and it kind of really makes sense to connect people and bring them together rather than running these as entirely separate, hermetically sealed groups. So if you're interested, you can go to bigchangeprogram.com, sign up for the test drive, and that way you'll get on the early notification list, because we're not going to be taking a whole bunch of people at once because we're still trying out this new concept. Okay, so this week's episode is a conversation between me and Josh LaJaunie as we're driving back from Marshall, Texas from Health Fest in early April in his truck. So the first thing to note is that it is not studio quality. It's me holding a handheld recorder and trying to remember to push it in his face when he's talking and bring it back to the middle when I'm talking. And I think it's clear enough, but you'll certainly get some sort of ambient traffic noises and wind noises and truck noises and stuff like that. But the reason I wanted to have this conversation with him was we were on a panel the day before, the closing panel of Health Fest, and fielding all sorts of questions from audience members, and somebody asked a question about bone broth. And I was going through in my mind the answer that I would give, which has to do with, nutritional biochemistry and all this stuff. And luckily, Josh got the microphone before I did. And he said, you got to think about this in terms of like naturally attainable quantities. Like how much bone broth could our paleo ancestors have actually created? Were they going out slaughtering enough animals that they could have a big pot of simmering bones and drink this stuff every day? Like, yeah, if you killed an animal, you'd probably take the bones, do something with it, make a broth, but you wouldn't have this on a regular basis. And it occurred to me that way of looking at things, of asking the question, what's the natural attainable quantity of this substance in nature, is a really good way of looking at a lot of things. It's a good way of answering the question about food without having to go into the science or without having to go into the ethics of vegan versus vegetarian versus omnivore versus reducitarian. That it's kind of a way of looking at everything, kind of a unified field theory of life, is what can we get and what do we have to give in naturally attainable quantities. So I put that to Josh, and we started thinking about it, and we decided on the way back, instead of counting cars or playing games with license plates, to have this conversation about naturally attainable quantities. So without further ado, here's me and Josh in a truck.
I think that simple concept of trying to identify, and if we could define what naturally attainable quantity is for the human animal, then nothing else matters. The argument between whether or not animal products in a human diet is good or which diet's better, a meat-based diet or vegan-based diet, or what's better, raw or cooked, or are nuts something that we should avoid, or all of the different things, I think, could be really summed up and simplified by being able to define clearly to people, for them to use as a tool, the concept of what naturally attainable quantity is and means for the human animal. And part of that is, like what we were saying earlier, is we probably need to identify the natural environment too as well, right?
Right. Well, so yeah, like there's no paleo diet. There were, hundreds of paleo diets. So so there's where the organism originated, right? So we have our airplanes and our migration, so we could be from somewhere else than we are now. But let's just take someone who lives, we're in Louisiana, heading down from Marshall, Texas to New Orleans. Did I say that right?
Close enough.
Close enough. New Orleans. New Orleans.
There you go. Look at you, boy.
So around here, there's it looks like there's a lot of standing water, a lot of paddies, a lot of swamp and forest. So take this micro environment, or any micro, just choose one, and probably the same principles will apply, although the specific foodstuffs might be a little bit different.
Exactly. And here, from being from Louisiana, you're gonna, you think about things in their naturally attainable quantity. At least I do, and I'm thinking about, just take an example of pecans, right? We got pecan trees all over the place, but a naturally attainable quantity of pecans is, first of all, it's got to be in season, and then second of all, if all you have is just very basic tools, even if you don't have basic tools, if you have really state-of-the-art tools to collect pecans and then shell them and then eat them, think about how much effort and time it takes to collect an entire handful of pecans that we can mindlessly, because of capitalism today and the way modern convenience is, we can just scoop handful after handful from a 5-pound bag that we bought at Sam's. It's whole food, it's plant-based, there's no oil, there's no added sugar, there's no salt, so everything is it's a compliant food, arguably. But in terms of quantity, you found a loophole. And if we go with a naturally attainable quantity as a measuring stick for how and what we eat, that sort of can fix everything.
So let's use pecans as an example. How would you think about a naturally attainable quantity?
A naturally attainable quantity would be like, if I was just, for the raw organism, human being, if I was a butt-naked human walking around in the woods and I found some pecans to eat, first of all, I'm going to collect them up, and then I have to figure out how I'm going to crack them open to get, first of all, I have to get that green husk part off, and then I have to get down to the hard part of the nut, and then I have to figure out what I'm gonna do to break into that nut, and then I have to do that process. And so how much pecan meat am I gonna be able to realistically collect in a given day or a given season, and then spread that out throughout my year? What does it look like? What does that look like? And so realistically, there's your quantity, natural, attainable quantity for the organism. So realistically, how is your pecan consumption today compare to that little hypothetical movie picture in your head?
Which also, so naturally attainable quantities can become the overriding, the single factor that we use to think about food, but it can also relate to other things. So if you're sitting on your couch all day, or if you have a desk job, what's your natural attainable quantity of pecans? It's 0, because you didn't move to get any.
That's exactly right. And you didn't move to get any, but even though you didn't move it to get any, there's still like a default naturally attainable quantity for the average human, which is what biologically we've evolved and adapted to expect nutritionally from like our nutrition uptake system, the amount of fats and fiber and all of the stuff that's in a pecan. There's the body's expecting a certain amount, a certain quantity of that, whether we get up and move around and move about for it or not. But if you're not moving for it, if you're not even achieving that basic minimum that the pecan gatherer would have achieved in getting said pecans, then you're really out of balance if you eat any at all. And so it's something that, even though it's a very natural food and it's arguably a very healthy food and arguably necessary, depending on who you listen to eat nuts, it can be a dangerous and a tricky food to deal with if you're not moving your ass around. So in order to mitigate that, we must also shoehorn in what would be a natural quantity, or at least attempt to introduce what would be a natural quantity of movement for the animal as well, to bring that collected food into balance with our movement. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So let's apply the rule of naturally attainable quantity to some other foods. Let's see how universal it is. So we were just shopping at Kroger, and you passed the nutty bars, right? Nutty Buddies or whatever it is, or some processed food. Like let's apply the rule to that.
That would be, well, you have to break it down into its parts and think about the sugar involved in a nutty bar. And just guessing, I know that, say, 1 tablespoon of sugar, I might be wrong on this, is about the same as a 6-foot long piece of sugar cane. So just hypothetically, first of all, you're going to eat a 6-foot long piece of sugar cane? No, you're not. That would be impossible for your body to process. So we've removed that from its natural state. But let's just keep, for argument's sake, that image. How many tablespoons of sugar is in that nutty bar? How many 6-foot long pieces of sugar cane is in that nutty bar? Is that a naturally attainable quantity and ability? Do we have the ability to assimilate that whole food, sugarcane stalk, into our bodies for nutrition? No. The other thing in there is made up of peanuts. It's a nutty bar, so the in between the layers is a really sugary peanut butter fudge type of a pasty type of delicious thing. So we have peanuts in that entire box, and we also have sugar and probably some milk, and then you have the chocolate that it's covered in. So we're talking about, processing, finding, collecting, and processing cacao to turn it into eatable chocolate, not to mention the milk involved in that milk chocolate. So then now we also have the other mammals' milk, if we're not using human breast milk in the chocolate in the milk chocolate covering for the nutty bar. So we have all of these huge levels of input, 6-foot stalks of sugarcane multiple times, some other mammal's milk that we need to find in a quantity such that we can mix it and turn it into this unctuous liquidy deliciousness from these cacao pods that we have had to collect and turn and dry and roast and turn in and grind into a powder to turn into chocolate, and not to mention all of the nuts, the peanuts involved in the peanut butter. So you have all of these big different piles of inputs, and if you look at it in their raw form and think about the energy involved, the leg work, the arm work, the back work involved in collecting that quantity of what would their rawest natural at their rawest natural state, the inputs, if you think about all of that involved to get just that one nutty bar, are you really moving in a way that's in balance with that naturally attainable quantity of those raw inputs?
So we're not saying never have a nutty bar, but we're saying in its naturally attainable quantity, you could have like one a year if you saved up for a month or two. Like this could be your treat.
That's exactly right. Not an entire box, but that's hard to do. If you can eat one nutty bar a year, that's kind of weird. That's kind of unnatural. The natural thing to do is to gorge on what's currently available, and for any animal. And so that's the tendency. We can recognize it that way. We can recognize those naturally attainable quantities in the disequilibrium between those raw inputs and our movement to acquire said raw inputs. But ultimately, we are path of least resistance ivores, just like all other animals. And so when that is laid in front of you, and it's an option, if you give yourself the option for that thing, more than likely, it's going to snowball into a gorge fest. That's how I operate it with that. So a naturally attainable quantity for a nutty bar, exactly like what Howard said, would probably be in the area of maybe that one nutty bar a year, which is so ridiculous that why fuck with it in the first place?
Right. So certain naturally attainable quantities are if we round them off, we attain peace.
Yes.
Right. All right. So let's talk about bone broth.
Well, bone broth is just what it is. It's bone broth. So it's broth made of bones of cows. And so there we go. Here we go again. We are assuming that cows, we would have to be able to naturally attain a quantity of cow, of other mammal or whatever, such that we would have bones left over to collect and turn into basically animal tea. And not only do we do that, the modern day argument is that it's super healthy and it's we need it almost, right? And were we really collecting animals in that quantity? Let's think about what it's going to take. This animal outweighs us by 10-fold. So if we're butt naked wild humans how are we going to take that animal down? Theoretically, could we would have to maybe, what if we chop a tree halfway and to where it's almost about to fall, and then trick the cow into the tree's path and chop it all the way, and by some miracle we get the tree to land on the cow and kill the cow, and then so now we get to, or buffalo or whatever wild version of a cow we would be dealing with back then. Think about all of the caloric inputs to achieve a dead cow that we're going to eat and then ultimately turn into bone broth. Are we really, when we're sipping that coffee cup full of bone broth, have we really invested those natural caloric inputs to attain that thing? No, not even close. It's not even close. It's a balance issue. We're not even close to that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, even if we then have our hunting tools,
right,
and we take it down, no human civilization has survived that over-hunted its meat population, right? So we would take the slow and the weak and the old,
right,
and every traditional hunting society honored the animal, its spirit, and hoped for its health and success as a collective, so that we could pick off the little bits we need to think about making bone broth, to take it and to concentrate this huge animal into something that we need 100 of them in order to get this liquid, means we would exterminate the herd.
Yeah, and then therefore exterminating your because eating animals is more, humans are brilliant creatures, and we have figured out over the eons that, instead of starving and going extinct, we have figured out that, yes, we can process and assimilate animal products, pieces of animal food into our bodies to keep from dying. But that's not what we're doing today. Lions, we stockpile these things and make this part of our regular diet when it is anything but regular food for humans. It is so irregular. It's not non-existent. I would be lying if I thought that humans are never supposed to eat meat. But what I'm saying is that we are basically herbivorous animals that stockpile meat for food, which is confusing, and part of our problem is confusing to me that that's what we do. Lions don't go around, like, you don't see lions stockpiling gazelles like, oh man, killed 8 of them today. That's not how lions operate. They are surviving, and our survival needs when it comes to meat are like minuscule. They're nothing. And it's about survival to me, and we would need all of these tools. We would need to leverage all of these modern technologies to be able to circumvent the caloric investment to even get a thousandth of what we're able to attain at the grocery store today.
So it's the same as sort of having a household budget, right? You get you don't get to spend more than you make unless you get a credit card.
Right.
And then you can overspend. And so our credit card is, all the technology that we're using is fueled by pulling things out of the earth that aren't going to be there for future generations. So our agriculture, our animal agriculture, it's all fueled, our transportation is all fueled by fossil fuels, which we are using up. And so it's like we're eating the calories that are in, sort of in the ground, that for future generations, we're consuming them all because we're exceeding our solar budget.
That's exactly right. And if we can address that pragmatically, we can do a couple of things. It makes us healthier. It shores up our future generations, survivability, let's say. Not only that, current day, it could remove a lot of the volatility in the oil field, which is at least help to mitigate that volatility. If our demand for that commodity was greatly reduced, it could even that out, and the wild swings in that market could maybe calm down. There's a lot of reasons to be more sensible about how we approach naturally attainable quantities, whether it's foodstuffs or the rate at which we can cut down trees, or the rate at which we can accumulate mileage, or what. It's just a really worthwhile thing to contemplate. And of all of the things that we're doing to contribute to this volatile market that's very important to my home state of Louisiana, eating animals in unnaturally attainable quantities is the biggest thing that we're doing that contributes to those wild boom bust cycles that we've experienced here in Louisiana for my whole life.
So if we look at eating animals, and let's make it even easier. Let's not be butt-naked humans out in the wild, but let's be modern humans with, cows and chickens and things like that in little farms. So we have chickens on our property, and if we didn't buy chicken feed, we would have to grow probably 2/3 of our land would have to be under seed to feed the chickens. And so as a result, if we don't buy feed, we could support maybe 2 chickens for a household of 4 on our dinner scraps. And the chickens we have now are like 4 or 5, 6 times bigger than the chickens from even 50 years ago. So let's take them as the natural, even though they're also hybridized like crazy and artificially selected for. But let's take like a 1950s chicken, which would have laid 30 eggs a year, and so we get 60 eggs a year from these 2 chickens, which is, for a family of 4, 15 eggs a person, which is about an egg every 3.5 weeks. And if we want it sustainably, if we want to keep getting eggs after those initial chickens have died, we're going to need a rooster. So one of those chickens has to be a rooster. So we're only getting 30 eggs a year from that one chicken, which is, half an egg a month per person, which I would say represents a naturally attainable quantity of egg.
Yeah, that seems more like a natural thing to me. I could see a wild human stumbling upon a nest with eggs that are not running away from them, and saying, "Oh, food that's not running away. I don't have to chase it." But that's not going to be something that you're going to find 3 eggs every morning with bacon for breakfast. It's going to be something that is very sparsely found in your diet, and it's random. At random times you come across it. And even in this modern existence, if you do it consciously, like you were talking about, you can approach that naturally attainable quantity with pragmatism and a little thought and give a fuck.
So let's take some more foods. Let's talk about whole grain bread.
Whole grain bread, even Ezekiel bread, the most pure, perfect, McDougall approved, Esselstyn approved, Rip approved bread, right? Think about what is grains. What is wheat? Wheat is seeds on the end of this big grassy thing. And so we would have to go and we would have to collect these big stacks of grass. And then we got to remove the grass from the seed. And then we got to remove the chaff from the seed. And then we have to figure out some sort of way to turn that seed into a powder that we then have to mix with water. And at least water. Let's just stick to water, right? So all of those inputs, think about all of those caloric investments to achieve that big quantity of seeds. Think about the amount of wheat that you would have to collect to get just one Ezekiel bread slice or one Ezekiel English muffin worth of end result. It would be astronomical. And are you really moving that much when you eat a slice of Ezekiel bread? Are you moving in a way that is close to or even approaching the amount of caloric inputs to collect one English muffin worth of wheat berries?
And I want to add another twist to that, which is you need, if you drive through the West and you see our monocrop agriculture or anywhere where there's big fields, right? The fields of wheat will stretch for hundreds of miles, or the fields of corn, or the fields of soybeans, or whatever the crop is, or rice, or sugar cane. So it by definition, to get the amount of bread that we get, we need monoculture, which makes us extremely fragile to drought, to pests, to something that to disease. That's something that if we're eating those foods that require huge amounts of input, even if we could do it, the civilizations that have been based on those collapse really easily.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That civilization is fragile to, just like you were saying, a drought or something. So it's just smarter to diversify across a given piece of land, to me, and it just makes good business sense. I don't see why you would say, I see why from I might be getting off topic here, but I can see why from a economies of scale point of view, why if someone has 1,000 acres would say, yeah, if I could just do 1,000 acres of wheat, boy, I could get all of the inputs necessary to grow that 1,000 acres of wheat a lot cheaper because of the volume that I would be purchasing at. However, all I have is wheat. So if I have some magic wheat weevil that comes in, all my 1,000 acres is fucked. Whereas if I split it up and I did 100 acres of different types of things, then that would be a lot more expensive inputs wise, because I wouldn't get those massive economies of scale. However, if I get a wheat weevil, it's only going to mess up my wheat, and then I have all of these other things to prop me up. That would be a smarter way to approach it from a business perspective. However, we have this unnatural thing called subsidies that keep that farmer assuming that risk, because the government absorbs the risk. So you can go and do these big monocrops, and therefore we create this naturally attainable quantity of this food that's not really natural in those quantities for this organism through very unnatural means of, through monetary incentives and capitalism and subsidies. But that's the world we live in today.
So I think it's in certain cases it's useful to add sustainably natural attainable quantities. So you could get a naturally attainable quantity for a day or a week or a month or a year or a decade or 100 years, which is still a blink of a gnat's eye in terms of geological history. And we're still vulnerable to collapse. So that, if we're doing our wheat, and more we need artificial inputs. We need petroleum inputs. We need chemical inputs. We need pesticides. We need things that possibly more and more people are getting sick from eating wheat. Maybe it's not the wheat. Maybe it's the pesticides, the glyphosates, the land is being degraded. So that's, it may look like a naturally attainable quantity as a snapshot, but over time it's absolutely not.
That's exactly right. We that huge monocropping protocol that we implement today is, like you were saying, it's raping the soil itself. The soil is where our nutrients come from. The plants are just a means for us to get the nutrients that exist inside of the dirt. We don't eat dirt. We have to use the plants to do it. And the dirt itself is being squeezed and sucked dry by these massive monocrop operations that don't really make good business sense in the first place. The only reason that they work is because they're artificially propped up. And just because we participate in eating from that well in what we perceive to be a quote-unquote naturally attainable quantity doesn't mean it's a great thing to support.
It's an artificially attainable quantity because of the artificial nature of the subsidies.
Right.
So, what do we eat? So what can we get in sufficient caloric and nutritional quantities that is sustainable and natural?
To me, what pops up in my mind is just, hand food. A lot of hand food, things that we would be like wandering through forests and foraging and finding, like I know I'm partial, but like apples and berries and greens, especially greens, because greens just, I don't know if you've ever seen a field of greens, but greens, once you identify the edible types, they're everywhere. And so those would be in my mind, make up by default just a big natural bulk of our nutrient uptake would be just greens, just a plethora of different types of greens. But not only that, roots and tubers, those types of, like what McDougall talks a lot about, those underground storage, those energy storage vessels. I think those are things, and eating, and I think we would be able to attain naturally decent quantities of those foods that would, such that it would make up a large bulk, an enormous bulk of our natural human diet.
Right. So if we're foraging, as our butt naked ancestors were doing, those are the things we come across. But as modern humans, if we're trying to get away from these monocropping, chemical-heavy, unsustainable systems that are killing the soil and our relationship to it, if we want to go back to basically like horticulture, like having a little garden, which is something I know is a very traditional. Whoa!
Easy. We're about to have a wreck, but
yeah.
Not really.
Yeah.
I'm on top of it, man.
With it. Yeah.
Interstate.
All right. I've completely forgotten everything we were talking about. That was a little frightening. So if you want to have your own little garden and you don't want petroleum inputs, you don't need a big tractor, you don't need fancy equipment, you can grow in your garden without, with your hands and basically some equivalent of a digging stick. Mm-hmm. You can grow tubers, you can grow sweet potatoes or potatoes easily, that a small plot can easily produce 200 pounds, mm-hmm. which we do, and which will last for months, which can last until spring. Yeah. All right. So you can grow your greens that can last all winter. With some of the greens are like completely resistant to freeze, to frost, to hail, to snow. Some of the really curly varieties of kale. And I've had the privilege several times in my life of just being out in nature and gorging myself on fruit to utter discomfort, which is something you can't do with a lot of foods in nature without these inputs. But just walking around, we're talking about blackberries, or you go into a fruit orchard, or even a single fruit tree. Yeah. The amount of fruit that a single fruit tree will produce over the course of its fruiting month is astronomical.
Yeah, and you're not right. It's exactly right. Nobody's walking around. You're not going to walk around. I remember as a kid, just wandering around and picking up blackberries this time of year, getting blackberries and eating blackberries off the bush off the bushes that would grow along the ditches and the bayous, and the levees where I'm from. You're not gonna go around and forage like a wild human would do and pick up handfuls of wheat berries and seeds and eat it just like that, or rice. You're not gonna go and grab a stalk of rice stalk and knock it off in your hand and eat it. That's not food. That's not our normal foraging food. Maybe we eat those things in small quantities because we've developed the skill to harness fire and cook, so we can take some of the tubers, but we can eat tubers raw as well. One of my favorite things when I was a kid was to go, my grandfather used to spread, turnip seed and mustard seed and rutabagas and on levees. And so what we would do as a kid is I would go and grab a turnip up out of the ground, and I would eat a turnip like an apple. It was very peppery tasting and pungent and strong, but in retrospect, that was just all of the beautiful chemistry that happens in plant life that we need to make our bodies healthier. It's our medicine. That's our medicine. And so yeah, I think that we're meant to just get food off of the ground. gorge with our hands, the things that we can pick up and collect. It seems unnecessarily slow, that turn, was it not?
Yeah. My wife says he wants to buy the corner.
Yeah. So gorging is like cool. That's what all animals do. Squirrels are not fucking counting their acorn calories. They're eating as many as they can get their hands on. And that's the type of eating that, animals do. They are eating as many as they can get their hands on. Lions aren't not collecting gazelles because they shouldn't. They're not collecting gazelles because they can't. And what they can get their hands on is just that one that they have to share. So I think that if we can understand that, yes, we are meant to eat volumes of food, pounds of food a day, if we can just understand what those pounds are supposed to be made of, and implement these naturally attainable quantity, this naturally attainable quantity litmus test, if you will, to that food poundage daily, boom, you got an automatic healthy lifestyle.
So in other words, the break, the limit to what we can eat or what any organism can eat is not internal. There's no kill switch for any organism to say, okay, I'm going to stop eating this hyper palatable delicious thing. Whatever it was, meat or eggs or milk or honey or fruit or whatever substance you'd put in front of any animal, if it's their food, they're going to eat as much of it as they can. The limitation was systemic. It was environmental. And so it's like a perfect system, like an invisible hand. You have all these creatures going around trying to optimize their input, and you have a system that naturally limits that input. Then everything that survives and evolves is exquisitely good at harvesting from its own niche.
That's exactly right. And to put that to test, to prove a point, anybody who's ever had a bird feeder in their backyard, if you see a squirrel, now that squirrel has an unnaturally attainable quantity of seeds that he likes to eat. And that squirrel is going to get fat as shit. He's not going to go anywhere. He's going to stay right there at that bird feeder and eat as much of the bird food as he possibly can. There is no calorie counting. And he's not wringing his hands over, oh, damn, I'm going to the bird feeder again today. Shit, I have to stop this eventually. No, he just sees it as a thing that's in his bailiwick, if you will, of food choices, and he's going to the well and knocking it out, getting it done every day. And that's kind of how we're meant to be. That environment for that squirrel has been unnaturally adjusted by a human.
We just passed a field of cows on our right. What about free range grass-fed beef? How is that unnatural right now?
It's still, whether it's free range or not, we have to think about what I was talking about earlier. How is the human? That's basically any pasture can be. We can think about it just like that bird feeder to the squirrel. Capitalism is providing a bird feeder of unnaturally attainable quantities to us, and we're the squirrel. You know what I'm saying?
Well, also, those cows are very placid and protected because we've killed all their predators.
Yeah.
Right? So if we still said, okay, these cows are hanging around, they're in the same numbers as we have them now, we would be competing with a lot of other creatures, and those cows would not be placidly sitting and eating the low grass, right? They'd have to be hidden from predators in tall prairies, and they'd be buffalo or
Sure.
whatever. If we just let wolves and foxes and bobcats come back, and we didn't protect all our livestock, there wouldn't be any cows, right? They're not a natural creature. They can't protect themselves.
No.
Right? Chickens can't really protect themselves.
No.
We need to put them in coops and corrals.
That's exactly right. We've created these animals that are basically just food waiting to die, and it's just this weird, twisted scenario now that, I am where I am today. And those words coming from my mouth with, the guy who still has the big pit and used to pride himself on his ability to make succulent ribs and perfectly cooked ribeyes and all. It's a stretch. I get it, but it makes more sense to me, and it's my pragmatism winning over. My pragmatism as a conscious human who cares about the health of himself and his family and his fellow man, making, yes, difficult decisions when you talk about it socially for something that is more natural. Not because I want to be vegan per se, but because I respect nature and I love nature, and I would love for us to be able to get closer to our natural state, whether that's the animals we keep or the state of our health and bodies, and mindset.
So I think this concept of, is it a naturally attainable quantity or a sustainably natural attainable quantity, can help us when we are getting into this lifestyle, and we have, naturally we have all these questions, right? As Sid was saying Sid Garza-Hillman was saying at this talk at the Health Fest, we don't devote this kind of scrutiny to our shitty diets, right? To our McDonald's and our Applebee's and our Bloomin' Onions at Outback and our, lean cuisine. We don't subject any of that to scrutiny, like, is it shitty enough for us? But all of a sudden, when we're going to a healthier diet, we have all these questions. And maybe the questions are coming from a good place of suddenly caring. So let's assume that. But we can easily get distracted by all the debates instead of just asking this very, very intuitive, universal question: is this a food that I could attain in a what is the naturally attainable quantity of this food? So it doesn't, ethical considerations aside, you can eat meat, you can eat fish, you can have nuts, you can have nutty bars, you can have anything. I suppose like Skittles probably couldn't exist with all their artificial colors and flavors,
right?
Which is, again, zero's a number. Like, to just ask this question, and then assume that if you ask that question, you can eat pretty much ad libitum and be in balance with your weight, your health, your ecosystem, and your planet.
Yes, and that's what I apply to everything that goes on my plate and that I put into my body. And I think it's worth explaining and defining and trying to get people to understand the concept. And it's a beautiful litmus test for anything that you're going to put into your body. Is this, and if you can answer this question honestly with yourself, is this, when I think of it in its rawest, most natural state, is this a naturally attainable quantity of this food? So, entire watermelon? Yeah. Yeah.
But not all year long.
Not all year long. But 10 pounds of crawfish? Problem. That's a little bit different. I used to eat 10 pounds of crawfish at a time. Not to mention 10 pounds of crawfish and 3 or 4 lengths of sausage and 2 or 3 ears of corn and a couple of potatoes. Right, we are getting way outside of not only our naturally attainable quantities, but our ancestral coon-ass attainable quantities. Those people were barely surviving, and they decide to eat these bugs out the swamp. It's not a celebration. We should celebrate the fact that they survived by surviving ourselves in our current environment. And that means sidestepping some of our traditions that have extrapolated into complete I don't know what the word I'm trying to say is here, but just complete out of balance, gluttonous behaviors. It's just out of balance. And we've taken these seeds of survival mechanisms and turned them into complete gluttonous protocols that are ironically killing us.
So you mentioned that you can eat some tubers out of the ground raw, like those turnips. But what about, like, you and I both get the bulk of our calories from tubers that have to be cooked, sweet potatoes and regular potatoes. So what about cooking versus raw? Like, you might think that if you're going back to butt-naked humans, that we need to be on raw food diets.
Right. And beans, and beans and legumes also. Those things are, I think, we can attain those things in big enough quantities to make meals of regularly. But yeah, so
right. And beans, as a gardener, beans, you plant a few rows of beans, they'll last all year. Again, you can get 50, 60 pounds from a 100-foot by 3-foot garden row. So you can certainly, again, the naturally attainable quantity is consistent throughout the year.
That's exactly right. I see us, you see a pea pod hanging from a tree. That makes good sense to me, that early human identifies that as, hey, food, and then we remember that, and then we go blah blah blah. It just makes good sense to me that that's good solid human food. But yeah, to cook those things, again, we're talking about, to be able to cook those, we had talking about having to go around, and we know we've harnessed the ability to cook food. I think that's pretty evident. I mean, I've seen some stuff on National Geographic that, fire pits from, 150,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago. And so I'm pretty sure that, we've been collecting wood to make fire for a very long time. So I think that cooking our potatoes and beans is a natural human thing. I think getting very fancy, culinarily speaking, might be fun and a good way to get people to transition from a very sad diet to one that is a lot more health focused and human centered. But at the end of the day, I think some of those we could talk about, maybe some of the techniques being done in kitchens as unnaturally attainable quantities. Think about all of the different fires required on a saute line or something, and even though it is perfect, no oil added, whole food, plant based, we get so caught up in making everything about culinary shits and giggles that we forget about our naturally attainable quantity of fire. I think having one heat source on which we sort of kind of very efficiently cook these things that need to be cooked for us to assimilate inside of our bodies and digest more properly, like the lycopene in beans and stuff like that. Those things go away once you cook them, and it makes it better for you, actually. So it's necessary, but I think we go over the top by doing all of these weird cooking. These, not weird, I don't mean to sound like I'm beating up restaurants or I just did that Iron Chef yesterday. I thought that was a really fun thing to see. But I think sometimes that we get too far away from how simple our natural food preparation actually is and should be and was. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and having lived in Africa for a year and having seen a lot of sort of Zulu culture in remote villages where there's an outdoor kitchen, and fire is something that is taken very, very seriously.
Yeah.
Because they're miles away from the store. They don't have any money to buy charcoal or whatever, and they certainly don't have propane and things like that. So they're collecting wood to make their fire, and they are very strategic about how that fire gets utilized every single step of the way. You use the early fire for certain things, the hot fire for, and then as it cools down in the ashes, you put your tubers in those and you have them the next day. And and the more communal you are, so talking about naturally attainable quantities, like humans in Western civilization are lacking naturally attainable quantities of community.
Yes.
So if you had a community kitchen, you could have 3 or 4 fires going, and you could have 3 or 4 different dishes. You'd have someone is stewing some birds in a pot, someone else is making the big thing of porridge, someone else is steaming the greens and chopping up the tubers. That, the more communal we are, the fancier we're allowed to get. So if you're sitting at home or you're just a couple going out to these fancy restaurants, there's again an imbalance. It's kind of a more subtle thing, but I think it's real.
That's exactly right, and I think that we have to, just like what you were talking about. That's exactly what I was fixing to say. Your fire, when you live in a environment of scarcity, is going to be temporary. There's a finite period in which that fire is going to be rolling. That fire is going to be good, and you'll use that fire. And so in that window, you get something cooked, but that thing that gets cooked is going to last longer than the fire, really. You're cooking something like, say, a bowl of potato, like a pot of potatoes. Those potatoes are going to outlast that fire. And so you're cooking on this fire that's temporary, but it's food that's also temporary, but it's going to last a lot longer on the fire. And also think about the caloric investment involved in collecting the wood to make that fire. And so just because it's a potato, think about the caloric investment necessary to eat 5 pounds of potatoes or whatever you're doing, and think about what it would take that African to prepare that poundage, if you will, of food, and keep that in your mind as you're eating even what is a whole food, plant-based, no oil added diet. We still need to concern ourselves with naturally attainable quantities of those foods to stay within an energy balance.
And we alluded to it earlier, but I want to talk specifically about naturally attainable quantities of movement, of exertion, of covering territory, because this is the flip side. Whereas with food, we're talking about natural limits, and with exercise, if we call it that, or movement or exertion, we're talking about unnaturally imposed minimums. So we actually have to go out and get more than we normally would.
Right. I like to think of myself in my life, and I know I don't achieve this. I know I fall shy of it, I'm sure, but I like to think of myself as moving across my territory with my own 2 feet, my bipedal locomotion, in a way. So in a way, I think about moving across my territory as if I were collecting the food that I eat. Does that make sense? Like, I want to move my body as if I had to forage all of the stuff that I buy at the grocery store. That is a big part of me running as much as I do. That's why I feel like it's natural for the human. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. I know I'm stumbling over it a little bit. We're kind of just, talking off the top of our heads, but I feel like there's a balance that naturally gets struck by all other animals, and us humans, because we're so smart and we've created this environment that makes it very hard to be natural, we have to shoehorn in our natural movement to balance our natural food, even our natural food. If we go all the way with a whole food, plant-based diet, I think it's still necessary for us to at least achieve, or at least approach the movement that would be necessary in the wild for us to attain those quantities of very healthy, tubers and greens and beans and fruits and stuff like that. Does that make sense to you too, or?
Yeah, so that's why if I run a marathon, I can eat differently that day. I can eat, I have to eat foods that are going to give me quick energy. So if it's, dates or nuts, whereas if I ate the quantity of, oh, what a beautiful bird.
Beautiful big egret.
Egret. If I ate the same quantity of dried fruit or dates or nuts on a regular basis, and I wasn't running 26.2 miles a day, I would be overweight.
That's exactly right. And that's how we can eat a whole food, plant-based, no oil diet and not lose weight. I see it a lot. And then the thing that gets thrown on there is, oh, this doesn't work. I've tried everything. No. You haven't tried naturally attainable quantities. You haven't tried being an authentic human in the ways of authentic human movement, in the authentic human menu. And those things, if you can get them in balance, will completely change your life and your happiness and your mindset and your approach and how you empathize and sympathize and love. Everything changed for me when these concepts really kind of clicked in my very simple, admittedly, mind, you know?
Right. So, you know, when you switched, like one of the big things you gave up were fried foods, yeah. Right? So that's like one of your nevers. Animal foods is a never for you, yeah. And fried foods. So let's talk a little bit about like oil in terms of naturally attainable quantities, because people, you know, throughout history have made things into oils.
Oh my God! Imagine the energy, the caloric. Again, I'm using this term again. The caloric investment and taking a pile of vegetables, right, and mashing them such that you get, we know vegetables don't have a lot of fat in them, right, but mashing them such that you get out that minuscule amount of fat into a liquid form and leave behind all of that. Think about the pressure involved, or the energy involved in creating this completely pure liquid fat from those vegetables or from the nuts or from whatever source it is to create that oil. Think about the energy necessary to create it, to make that thing even be in existence. It's astronomical. And are you moving in that way? No. That food is off the table. That food is not food. It is a completely machinery created substance. It's a chemical. It's purely liquid fat. That's all it is. It is not food. And it was a big part of my diet. Everything I started, people don't think of gumbo as fried food, but gumbo is totally fried food. Gumbo is fried food. Sauce piquant, fried food, because you are basically starting with a couple of cups of fried oil. That fried oil, that roux, is basically nothing more than the crispy part of the chicken. That's all it is. That's all it is. And so there's a big disconnect between fried food and people understanding the detrimental effects of oil. People often say, oh, well, I don't eat fried food. Most of the time they say, oh, I don't eat that much fried food. Any is too much, in my humble ex-fat opinion, right? So fried food is out for me because of those factors, those factors involved, of how much energy goes into creating oil in which we fry all of these things. So the oil is a terrible medium for food. It's a great medium for taste. It is an amazing medium for crispiness and mouthfeel and taste, and it works wonders for restaurants and revenues. I totally get that. And it's a hard thing to step away from for people who make their living on that. I understand that. But it's not food, and it's a huge part of why so many of us, besides the natural attainable quantity aspect of it, just think about your greasy dishes in the sink after a fat heavy meal. Think about how hard it is to clean a plate after it's had fried chicken sitting on it and it's gotten cold and it's congealed on the plate. Think about the gross residue grease residue in a sink. Think about how pipes get clogged. I have rental property and people who drain pans from after cooking hamburger meat and pour it down the drain. The P-traps get full. I see it in lift stations underneath our sewer pumps. I have a sewer business, and I see just islands of grease, solidified, coalesced grease particles floating in lift stations all the time. This stuff is what's in our arteries. It's why Memo died at 67 years old. It's why my Bam Bam doesn't know where his bedroom is. It's literally the culprit. It's what's clogging our bodies. It's what's clogging our cardiovascular systems from feeding our brains and feeding the rest of our bodies. It's what's blocking the nutrition that our bodies is taking up from everything that we eat and getting it where it belongs in all of the different tissues. And it's what's starving our bodies from healing through cellular regeneration. It's a problem, not just the caloric, not just the naturally attainable quantity part. That is tangential to us not being naturally able to achieve this thing as a food.
All right. So again, if you listen to some people, they'll say, well, everything in moderation. So then let's say, what is moderation around oil? So let's say, canola oil is your oil of choice, or soybean oil. Like, let's go out into that field. Let's plant the field.
Yeah. And
harvest the field. And like corn oil is also a very popular oil for frying in restaurants. You ever eat an ear of corn? How oily is it? There's no oil. There's oil in it, but you wouldn't even notice it. You don't taste it. So how many acres of corn does it take to make a cup of corn oil?
Exactly.
Like, that's the amount. However many acres you are willing to hand sow, tend, weed, plow, process, that's how much oil you get to eat. And it's not it may not be zero, but it ain't what you're eating.
That's exactly right. And that's my point. And that's why it's a forever never food for me. And that's why I know that was one of my biggest issues in my life. We just stopped at a gas station, and I showed you how we roll in Louisiana at gas stations a lot of times is, you have the boudin balls and fried chicken and meat pies and all of these. We have this big vat of unnatural substance that we stick food in that makes it hyper palatable, and we just clamor over it. But think about what Howard just said. How in the hell are we able to achieve that vat of liquid fat in our individual lives? Just counting the portion, if you eat one meat pie, the portion of oil that it took to fry that one meat pie, not counting all the shit in the meat pie, just the oil that it took to fry that meat pie. Think about all of the inputs necessary to create that 2 or 3 cups of liquid as a cooking medium for that thing. It's just insane. And that's why it's gone for me forever. I'm totally okay with that.
And if you're listening to this because you love animals and you're coming at it as an ethical vegan, how the hell is it ethical to take up that much habitat of every other creature on Earth so that we can get our oil, our flour, our sugar? So yeah, we're not pulling the trigger, but we're every piece of land is either supporting life or it's not. And so if we're eating crap, if we're eating highly palatable, highly concentrated stuff that is extracted from actual plants that we are growing in monocrops, then we are preventing a lot of other creatures from having their natural life. And I don't see how that's any different from killing chickens or cows.
Amen. I couldn't have said it any better myself. I totally agree with that. I think it's just as I think it's unethical to participate in that paradigm, whether you're vegan or not. And that's one big thing that I would love to see different about this entire movement. And I do feel like it's happening. I feel like the no oil thing is getting legs, and the clouds are starting to lift, and people are starting to see the sunlight, through the vegan junk food.
So I think we've covered pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. Do you have any wrap-up thoughts?
No, not really. That was just an amazing conversation with a brilliant mind, and I'm just beside myself that I'm driving through Louisiana with Howard Jacobson, talking about something that I'm very passionate about, and we're recording it for posterity. I'm totally giddy like a schoolgirl, and thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'm totally giddy that I actually managed to turn on the recording button and actually managed to get the recording. So, and right back at you, like this concept of naturally attainable quantity is not my concept; it's yours. I got it from you, and it's just such, and it came up again because in the panel at Health Fest, somebody asked, what was the question?
About bone broth. It was really about.
No, it wasn't. It was another question about how can you tell, like the latest fad? How do you know?
Right,
how do you,
that's what it was.
Right, and my answer was, there were three answers that were all useful, I think. My answer was, what was my answer? If this was true, would humans have survived? Right, and then the doctor, Jennifer Singh, had an answer that I thought was more complete, saying, someone says that to you or you read about it, say, great, I'm very interested in that. Show me the 20-year studies, epidemiological and clinical, that show that this is healthy for human beings and increases longevity over the long term. And then you spoke, and you said...
I said that my litmus test for anything I ingest is, I think to myself, is this a naturally attainable quantity for the human animal?
And see, what I love about that is that you don't need to be an evolutionary biologist to figure this out. You don't need to be able to read all the pages in PubMed. You just need to have a basic, curious, coon-ass intelligence, and I'll just say native intelligence, like every human culture has until we are brainwashed by consumption culture. Like everyone can find it in themselves to ask that question. That's a question, that's a skill that everyone has innately, to just say, is this a naturally attainable quantity of this particular substance? It takes almost no education. In fact, the type of education that you would have growing up native, in touch with nature, in touch with natural cycles, and being out in the woods and eating turnips off the ground and playing and eating blackberries. When you don't grow up in suburbs and cities where food is always something you get from a shelf or a restaurant or a delivery truck, I think it's a human inheritance to be able to ask that question. And as we've been kicking it around, I think it is the most profound and universal question we can ask about just about any human endeavor. So I am so happy that you have kind of elucidated this for me.
Well, I'm flattered. I would go one step further, I think, and say it's more than a heritage. It's a human mandate to think of how we consume in that way. And I'm flattered that you think something I have to say is useful. This is amazing to me. It's been an amazing, eye-opening experience, and it honestly helps me grow daily in my confidence of myself and my own thought processes. So you're helping me grow, and it's an amazing thing. And I'm just extremely proud to be part of this, and proud to have you as a friend.
Amen, brother. So that's a wrap.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Plant Yourself podcast, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes. And for more information about the Big Change Program led by me and Josh, visit bigchangeprogram.com, and be sure to check out the show notes for today's episode at plantyourself.com/210. That's 210. If you're new to the show, you can catch up on 209 archived episodes over at plantyourself.com. And if you get the podcast but not the newsletter, The Big Change Bulldog, you can sign up and get the no recipe required cheat sheet at plantyourself.com/cheat. Let's hear it for the generous patrons who help me financially so that I can spend time on this show. They include
Kim Harrison, Lynn McClellan, Anthony Disson, Brittany Porter, Dominic Marrow, Barbara Whitney, Tammy Black, Amy Good, Amanda Hatherley, Mary Jane Wheeler, Ellen Kennelly, Melissa Cobb, Rachel Behrens, Christine Nielsen, Tina Sharp, Tina Ahern, Jen Volkanovsky, David Bizek, The Mysterious, Michelle X, Elizabeth Feldman, Victoria Dolomanova, Leah Stoller, Alan Christensen, Colleen Peck, Michelle Landry, Josina, Julianne Rowland, Stu Dolnick, Sarah Durkis, Rhymes with Circus, Kelly Cameron, Wayne Pedersen, Leanne Peterson, Janet Selby, Claire Adams, Tom Franzak, Jeanette Benham, Gila Lacerte, for your generous support of the podcast. I got to say, I'm getting better at this. I need some more names to keep challenging my VO2 max here. And thanks also to Will Ridenauer for allowing me to use his gorgeous song, Sabali Don, Dance of Peace. You can find more of his music at willridenauer.com. If you would like to support the show and challenge my VO2 max, you can share this and other episodes on social media and via email. You can write a review on iTunes, or you can become a patron of the show with a one-time gift or ongoing contribution over at plantyourself.com. Speaking of iTunes, I was moaning last week about a dearth of reviews on iTunes. And then right after I recorded, I went to iTunes and looked, and there were 4 new ones. So I want to read 2 of them today. One is by MMP Random, saying, my favorite plant-based podcast. And it says, Howard Jacobson is a great interviewer. He has interesting and knowledgeable guests. Amen to that. He is smart, insightful, and compassionate. Aw. I strongly recommend this podcast. Lots of different topics are covered. It's never boring. Oh, thank you so much, MMP Random. And 2 days later, May 5th, Ingmod writes, I love this podcast. This is one of my favorite podcasts. Howard has great guests and asks insightful questions. I come away from every episode happy. I spent my precious time listening to it. I am sorry it's over, and come away with excellent takeaways, such as the title of a book or podcast I'll want to investigate. Howard also links to helpful articles. I particularly liked his article about saying never to certain trigger foods. It has helped me so much. I also like how genuine Howard is, sharing his own experiences from time to time. I highly recommend this podcast if you're interested in health. Wow. Well, that's amazing. And the thought that, that I'm a worthwhile candidate for your precious time is really meaningful to me. So thank you so much, Ingmod. So garden news, the beans are up. I went to the garden yesterday. The beans are almost all up. I had to replant a couple of them, but basically like 40 or something bean plants. And I looked at those beautiful dicot leaves pushing out of the soil, and I got teary. It's like I did almost nothing. And just by being in harmony with these mysterious, ineffable, incredible natural forces, like stuff's coming up out of the ground, and it might feed me and my family this summer, fall, and through the winter. Like, wow. In running news, I got the Umstead Half Marathon on May 21st, and I've decided to do it as a training run, which means basically I'm going to run 13 miles the day before as part of my plan to prepare for the Leadville Marathon on June 17th. So that's the question, is can my ego handle not coming in with a good time, not chasing the other runners, but just sort of having a good training run, hanging out with my buddy Gio, and just enjoying beautiful Umstead Park in Raleigh, rather than trying to make this a PR. We shall see. That's it for this week. So as always, be well, my friends.